Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to look at the ultimate workflow of how to take our image from the raw capture imported into Lightroom, untouched as in here, then look at how we would apply settings in Lightroom before taking it to Photoshop for final adjustments and preparation prior to printing, such as this image. Now, some of these steps won't apply to every photograph, but this will give you an idea of the sort of things and the orders in which we should apply them in taking an image all the way through to a completed work of art ready for printing. So let's look at the initial settings that we would apply in Lightroom. So here we are in Lightroom, and this is a version of the image imported with no settings applied. As you can see here in the develop panel, there's been no settings applied to it. And the important thing to remember is when we're out in the field capturing our image, we need to concentrate on the things that can't be changed later on in processing, such as the focus point, the overall exposure, and generally things like composition, etc. We don't need to worry about things like color balance, contrast, color saturation, because all of those things are applied after we bring it into Lightroom. And I've covered all of these in the 60-second quick start guide to Lightroom, and I'm not going to go through all of those now, but let's just have a look at another version of this image where I've applied some adjustments in Lightroom. And you'll see here that I've fiddled with the overall contrast in the image. I've played around with the highlights and the whites adjustments to bring back some of the highlight detail, and I've added some texture and clarity and some vibrance to the image, as you can see here. And if we go back to the original image, you'll see that quite a big difference in the color balance. The other thing that I have changed is that I've used auto white balance on this, and in the forest, in particularly situations like Tasmania where you've got a lot of green foliage, the auto white balance settings in a lot of cameras will tend to push the white balance more into the magenta end because it thinks there's too much green. But what I've done is I've moved that back. Sorry, I've gone to the wrong image. I've moved that back from what it was in the original capture, 39 magenta. I've pulled that back to give us a little more realistic white balance. And of course all of that can be adjusted in your raw processing. And of course I've applied some sharpening to this image. It was shot at the base ISO for this camera, 64, so there's no real need for noise reduction, but it was a long exposure, 0.6 of a second. But I have applied sharpening to add back the detail that's lost in the processing. And of course I've also applied lens corrections to remove things like chromatic aberration and lens distortions. So with those things done and looking at the overall balance of the tones, I'm ready now to take that into Photoshop. And if you want to go through the Lightroom steps in more detail, look at the video that's linked here and we can explain those in more details. But the main thrust of this video is to show you the steps and the order in which we make them. So firstly, Lightroom, we do our basic adjustments, get the image roughly where we want it to be, so that then we can do the finessing steps in Photoshop. So here we are in Photoshop, and I've opened the image from Lightroom, and I'm now ready to do the final adjustments and fix up a few of the little defects in the image. Now the first thing you'll notice in this image is that there are a number of little distracting elements. This stone in the foreground, this broken off stick in the background, and this rather bright little bit of foliage also in the background. And what I would do before I do anything else is I would go and fill those areas in and get rid of them so that I can then go ahead and do my final adjustments. And the way we would do that, we would use the Content Aware Fill as our first preference, and if that doesn't work we could use the Clone tool or the Patch tool, but normally the Content Aware Fill tool will work really well. And with an area like this broken off old stick, I would use the Quick Selection tool, making sure we have a plus selection so that we can add to a selection, and I'm just painting very roughly over the image, as you can see here, and it's making a pretty good job of selecting the area I want, and of course it's going to pick up a few things I don't want. In this case we're not going to be too worried about that because we're going to fix some of this up a little bit later on, and I'm going to come down here and add a little bit in here because we need to just fix this up a little bit later on. Now with that selection active, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we've got a soft edge and that we've got a transition between what we're going to fill this with and the background. So firstly we would go up to the select menu, modify, expand, and I would expand that between 5 and 10 pixels. Let's say 10 pixels, and we've expanded it. And now I'm going to go to select, modify, feather, and we'll feather that by 5 pixels so that when we fill this with the new information, we're going to have a nice soft transition between this and the background. So with that selection active, we would now go to edit, content aware fill, and with our brush we will paint in where we're going to fill this from, and generally following around the edges of where we're going to fill. And on the right hand side here we have a preview of how that's going to look. Now that looks pretty good to me, so I'm going to say OK, and we'll proceed and fill that in. So here's the result of the exercise of doing the content aware fill, and it's done a pretty good job. Now if I go up and then deselect the original selection I've made, there's a little bit of funny business up here, but it's generally not too bad, and it's very small in the frame, so we're not going to worry too much about that. But what I do have a problem with is down here we've lost a little bit of the edges of this ribbon plant because of the selection ran all the way through that, and we've filled that with something else. But what we can do is we can use our mask tool to just paint back in the areas that we want. Now if I hold down Alt and click on the mask, you'll see here that the mask on this layer that contains the fill items, I've now painted through that mask with a black brush, very fine, to then reveal those little bits of foliage that were in front of the broken stick, but of course were not picked up when I did that quick selection. And you can see if I just left it as it is, it's a bit noticeable, but by then painting with the mask to reveal those areas and then zooming back, it looks pretty realistic. And we can do the same thing with these other couple of areas. This area down the foreground, or sorry, this area here, I can't remember the order in which I did these, but that area there was done with the same treatment. And looking at this little bright rock in the foreground, I did the same thing again. And by using that feathering and expanding the selection, you can get quite a good fill in detail. And if you really don't like the replication of some of the details, you can always clone over that. But at this point we've I'll delete, that's the version I did just now, but let's have a look now. We've gotten rid of all of those elements that we didn't like. The next thing I would do, and depending on the image, is I would make a composite of all of those, or I would flatten it if I was doing this as a normal process, and I would make a new version of this image, and I would apply either the Topaz Denoise or the Topaz Sharpen AI filters to bring back some detail. And in this instance I've applied them both. So I've made a composite of all of those layers below, and I've now applied the Topaz Denoise and Sharpening. And you may not see this on your screen, but when you work on your own image you'll see that there's quite a remarkable addition of sharpness and detail brought out through applying those filters. Now I don't normally recommend third-party software, but in the case of Topaz it's a remarkable piece of software and well worth the investment if you really care about bringing out the fine detail in your images. So having done that, I've now decided that the rest of it looks pretty good, but there's a couple of other issues I want to address. If we look at the side of this image, I've caught the edge of another tree here just because of the position I was in to take this photograph. That was a bit of a distraction. Now I could remove that and get rid of it, but there's also a little bit of stuff happening down the bottom of the image that I'm not terribly happy with, and I'm going to do a little bit of the perspective warp, and I'm going to turn that on now. And you'll see here that what I've done, if I double click on this I can re-enter the filter. I've applied the perspective warp transition into this, and there's a separate video on this called how to recompose the image after the shot, and you'll see here how we apply a grid to the image and then stretch the various elements. And in this case, I've pulled the bottom of the image down and I've stretched the middle bit just a fraction to give this a little more emphasis. And once I've done that, I've then applied things like I'll just say OK with that, and converting this composite layer into a smart object allows me to go back in and reapply any of those filters that I apply to the image again and readjust them. So using a smart object is a really good way to allow us to transition this image all the way through to the final adjustment. Now, in addition to that, I've applied some Nik filters to this, the Color Efex Pro and a little bit of Silver Efex Pro blended to luminosity to adjust the tonality of the image to get it the way I wanted it to look, which is the way I remember the scene. And you'll see now that with that stretching, I've eliminated that part of the image on the right, and I've pulled a bit of this down the bottom so it's no longer a distraction. But having got to there, I've decided that there's still a little bit of a problem, and these couple of stones here really do distract me, so I'm going to fix those up later on. But let's just have a little look now at what else I can do. Well, I can apply a curves adjustment here and just check to see if my color balance has drifted away from what it should be after I've done my processing in Lightroom. And the way that we can do that, and I'll just recreate this, is to apply a curves adjustment to the image and then using the auto settings. Now, to determine what those auto settings are, you need to hold down the Alt key when you click on auto, and it will bring up this menu. And what we want to do is we want to enhance the monochromatic contrast and neutralize the midtones. And if you tick that and say save as defaults, and then we've applied this as an auto setting, I'll go back to the default setting and click on auto, and you'll see here in the curves adjustment there's a very slight tweaking of the 3 channels, and it's very, very minor, but it's just given that a slightly different white balance, and I think I was drifting a little bit more towards too yellow, so I've brought that back. That's the duplicate of what I've just done, so we'll delete that. And then finally I decided that this stone was a bit of a problem, and I've sort of left it a little bit late in the processing to do this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a blank layer above all of these layers below, and I'm going to clone that in using the clone tool. And you'll see here that it's not perfect because I've picked up areas from here and here and blended them in as best I can, but I think in the overall analysis it still looks pretty good. But I do have a little bit of an issue still with the brightness of the colors here, and if you've been to Tasmania you'll know that the moss actually almost glows luminescently with this bright yellow color, and that's how it looks, but it looks a little bit too bright. So what we're going to do is we're going to just adjust that down with a curves adjustment and with a mask, and you'll see here that if I overlay the mask over the image using the Alt key, I've just painted in the darkness here to just take away some of the brightness in that area and soften the edges a little bit. And one of the problems with any adjustment in Photoshop is that you'll get a little bit of an increase in saturation when you darken an image. So I've also gone in and done a little bit of an adjustment with the brightest part of the image, and then I've just taken a little bit of color out of those areas. You'll see particularly here, take a little bit of color out of that bright area so that it's no longer affecting us. And then finally, the last thing I will do is I will put a slight vignette on the image, and there's a really simple way to apply a vignette on an image. It's just about 3 simple little steps. The first thing we do is we use our lasso tool, which is the one shaped like a lasso, funnily enough, and I would just draw an area around the image where I want to highlight. So the important part of the image is this part. I've drawn a selection here. Now that we've drawn a selection, I need to feather that because I want a very soft transition between this part and the background. So we go up to Select, Modify, feather, and in this case not 5, but we want as the maximum that we can do, which is 360 pixels. So we now have a very soft edge. You can't see that with the marching ants, but we'll see it shortly. With that selection still active, we go select, inverse, so that now our selection is on the outside of this part, so that the effect we're going to apply is going to transition from here to here. And if we now, with that selection active, I'll just do a new curves adjustment. You'll see here, here's my selection, and if I just pull the white point down slightly and pull the middle of the curve down a little bit, you'll see here's my very simple vignette. And if you're not happy with the overall effect, you can either readjust it here, or you can just simply change the opacity until you get a soft transition. And with all of that done, your image is now ready to print or to apply to the web or whatever else you wanted. So here we are, we've completed our image, and I've used a number of steps here that I wouldn't necessarily use on every image, but what I've tried to do here is to show you that there are a number of steps you can undertake to get the image where you want it to look. And some images will require maybe all of these and more. Other images will be quite simple and not require all of this filling and content aware fill, etc. But it's worthwhile knowing that the most important part is to get our initial processing right in Lightroom, because we're adjusting the basic data coming from the camera, and then once we get it into Photoshop we can do those finessing and final steps. Certainly we can do things like the fill and spot removal tool in Lightroom, but in these sort of things it's not as effective as Photoshop. And of course, doing those final tonal adjustments and very minor steps such as the saturation and tonality, we need to be working in Photoshop to do that. So I hope this workflow explanation has been useful. I look forward to seeing you again soon.